beats.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another Sip with Quee podcast edition. Today we're here to discuss the current situation brewing in Chicago on the west side. We're here to discuss the Latinos attacking black people. First, on this video, this will be a two-part video. I want to discuss with you the history of Little Village and the Latino communities in Chicago. And then we will get into what's been going on. So sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy the show. Little Village, this area named after Peter Crawford, who bought 160 acres of land and gave a piece to Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad to ensure that there will be a stop in his community. Settled in 1827 and annexed in 1889. The boundaries are Ogden West Avenue on the north, railroad track along 33rd Street on the south, Western Avenue on the east, railroad tracks on the west, Little Village, Ogden Avenue, railroad tracks on 33rd Street on the south, Kedzie Avenue on the east, railroad tracks on the west. Gangs found in Little Village, that will be 2-6, Sin City Boys, Ridgeway Lords, Latin Kings, Gay Lords, Ridgeway Boys. Gangs headquartered there will be the 2-6 and Latin Kings. If you're not from Chicago, I know that just sounds like a bunch of street names and railroad tracks, so here's a map of Chicago so you can get a visual. This area was first settled in 1872 as the largest part of the Londell Crawford settlement. From there, many farms were built in the area. In the year 1863, the expansion of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads caused Lawndale and Crawford to become separate communities, with Lawndale on the north, and this area became Crawford. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, many German, Irish, Dutch, and Scottish immigrants fled to this area to start a new life far outside from the walls of the intercity. In 1873, McCormick Reaper Works built the brand new facility in South Lawndale right after the Chicago Fire of 1871, and this made the area even more attractive to immigrants looking for housing near employment. This area was annexed during 1889. The major annexation plan of 1889 in the area was renamed South Lawndale. This area remained mostly farmland until the 1900s decade, when the Western Electric's Hawthorne Works was built in nearby Cicero, and the Sears Roebuck Tower was constructed in neighboring North Lawndale. Now, new subdivisions were laid out. Czechoslovakians began moving in large numbers to the community as Irish, Dutch, and Scottish began moving out. In the 1940s decade, the Czechs were joined by a large influx of Polish immigrants that were lured in by many manufacturing jobs in the area. Now Germans, Czechs, and Polish dominated the area. In 1942, the Chicago Housing Authority built the North Lawndale Gardens public housing project in order to house impoverished white citizens that were employed to help with the war effort but were too poor to afford housing. These projects were built between 25th and 26th Street and between California Avenue and Washtenaw Avenue. In the early 1950s, a smaller influx of African Americans moved into the neighborhood, especially in the Lawndale Gardens projects, which sparked some outrage in the community. In the year 1950, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club that we know of today opened the notorious club House Garage in Little Village at 25th and Rockwell. I didn't know the whole exact story, but some young men in the neighborhood were bothered by this and formed their own club to battle the Outlaws called the Gay Lords. In that same year of 1950, at 24th and Whipple. One brawl between Outlaws and Gay Lords made the newspaper in 1954. Gay Lords eventually dominated a large area of about 21st Street to 26th Street and also in the Harrison High School by the late 1950s. The Outlaws MC did not claim territory, they just roamed wherever they pleased and did not care about any Gaylord turf, which caused more animosity. In the 1950s decade, the Outlaws Gaylords ran Little Village and the two gangs clashed bitterly. Any other gangs that were smaller greaser clubs comparison to these two larger forces. In the early 1960s, Mexican families began to settle in Little Village, especially by 1962. As the families arrived, there was heavy objection to their arrival, and since Gaylords and Outlaws were successful in keeping blacks out of Little Village in the 50s, they figured they would be successful in keeping Mexican people out. Mexican families and youths were bullied and beaten by greasers to the point where Mexican youth stood up to it, and the first Mexican street gang in Little Village was created. In 1962, White Sal created Markings. This gang of Mexican youth fought white greaser clubs tooth and nail, and soon spread into popularity as they claimed territory at the 24th and Marshall Boulevard, the Boulevards. This territory was right outside Harrison High School and the elementary school across the street, which helped young Mexican youth get to and from school safely, especially since the Gaylords were in Harrison High School. In the year of 1964, the Imperial Street Gang leader from Wicker Park visited Markings and discovered they had something in common. They had the same symbol, and both groups dealt with bullies. The leader of the Imperials proposed a merger at Humble Park. The meeting took place and the Latin Kings were born. Now all Markings became Latin Kings and they ran the boulevards. The Gaylord left his neighborhood by mid-1960s as members joined the military as soon as the Vietnam War started. Many other partook in white flight and moved out of the area. After the Gaylords left Little Village, it was mostly dominated by Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords, but the two gangs were not rivals at the time. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club changed direction and became a club for older men and took their focus away from brawling with street gangs in the streets. By the end of the decade, white flight increased rapidly as more Mexican families moved into the area. Lack of employment at the local manufacturing jobs made the area less attractive to the middle class, whites, Czechs, Polish, and German residents. They began to evacuate to the suburbs. As the white residents left, the meaning behind Little Village changed into a new identity as La Villita, or Little Village. The loss of manufacturing jobs only became worse in the 1970s as Mexicans in the area fell into poverty. The Latin Kings and Ridgeway Lords dominated Little Village in the second half of the 60s and almost all of the 70s. There were several smaller gangs in the neighborhood at the time, but these two were by far the largest. The drug trade took shape in this neighborhood in the early 1970s, and by the mid-1970s, the gangs began to wage war over drug turf. Not so much Ridgeway Lords, but the Latin Kings and the 2-6 are at war over drug turf that just began heating up in the mid-1970s. New gangs would form in Little Village, like the Latin Counts, Ambrose, Villalobos in the 1970s, but none would come close to equalizing the size of the Latin Kings. Latin Count gang members moved into the Lawndale homes, as many Mexican families were living in these projects as well. Eventually, Latin Counts left the projects and Latin Kings, Vice Lords, gangster disciples had full control. But the surrounding area was completely controlled by Latin Kings. It wasn't until the 2-6 organization took form in 1972 that the Latin Kings would meet their most ferocious rival. 2-6 began just as drug dealing curfew, but then evolved into a full-blown street gang by the 1970s. As the 1970s progressed, 2-6 would gain more and more popularity in the western Little Village, mainly in K-Town section. As 2-6 grew, they gunned for drug territory and attempted to mow down as many Latin Kings as possible. This sparked a vicious and very violent war. By the 1970s, 2-6 was emerging as a larger gang, and this when the Satan disciples 2-6, Ambrose, 2-2 boys, and Ridgeway Lords became allies. Ridgeway Lords were now at war with the Latin Kings. By the early 1980s, the Ridgeway Lords began shrinking in number, and the 2-6 was exploding with popularity. This is when 2-6 became dominating the rival gang to the Latin Kings, and now the big war of Little Village and Latin Kings versus 2-6. The 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s saw the most violent years on the streets of Little Village, mostly due to the back and forth violence between 2-6 and Latin Kings as they continued to hit each other back and forth. Little Village will often be regarded to as one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago. In the 21st century, the violence has toned down, but some of it is still an area plagued with violence and crime. One of the poorest Mexican communities in the city. Eventually, 2-6 and Latin Kings suppressed every other gang to the point where they couldn't really claim ownership of the territory on the streets. Villalobos, Ridgeway Lords, Sin City Boys, and Gaylords have been pushed out from the area, mainly because members have flipped to 2-6 or Latin Kings. Little Village is the hub of Mexican culture and is proud of their heritage. It is a neighborhood with great restaurants, hardworking people, and even though gang violence is heavy in these streets, there is no need for fear passing throughout or shopping this community because gang members are not trying to cause trouble with law-abiding citizens for the most part. Mainly it is just gang against gang violence. Little Village is the birthplace of the Southside Latin Kings, 2-6, Sin City Boys, and Ridgeway Lords.